Well, good afternoon, and thank you very, very much for joining us for our second Behind the Book series event. Today, we're very, very excited to have with us Indre Viskontas, the author of the book, How Music Can Make You Better. And she's going to be interviewed by Maia Jasper White from Caltech's Performing and Visual Arts program, and she is the head of our chamber music programming. So we're happy to have them both here, and we just got to let you know that that wonderful music you were hearing as during the intro, which actually the voice of Indre Viskontas. So she's not only a writer, she's not only a singer, she's also a neuroscientist, and we're in for quite a treat. I want to start off by thanking the Caltech Employees Federal Credit Union and the Friends of Beckman Auditorium, who even during this pandemic have continued to be supporters of the events that we're producing. And we encourage you all to go to events.caltech.edu to find out about the additional events that we're doing for as long as the pandemic lasts. These will be virtual events that you can join. Most of them are for free, and we hope you'll be coming and joining us for many of them. Because next week is Earth Week, we've got a bunch of things happening. It starts off at 5 o'clock on Monday the 19th with a program called 3-Minute Thesis. And we will be featuring grad students, some that are about to get their PhDs and some that are a year or two away from their PhDs, trying to explain to those of us who may have stopped studying science when we left high school what their thesis is all about. And they'll be doing 3-minute versions. There's going to be 12 participants in this program, and you're all invited to join us for that. You can find out more about it again at that events.caltech.edu. On Wednesday, we have a Watson lecture, which again is at 5 o'clock, and it'll feature Jonas Peters, who is the head of the Resnick Sustainability Institute. Our Performing and Visual Arts division is presenting a play called The New Galileos on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, the 22nd, 23rd, 24th at 7 o'clock. And there will be a discussion on Friday, I think it is. There's going to be a discussion about the play itself and about sustainability. So we hope you'll join us for that. It's about geoengineering. That'll be at 11:30 on the 23rd. And the Watson, I should mention, the title of that is Sunlight to Everything, Catalyzing a Sustainable Future. So we hope you'll join us for those as well. Well, now it's time for me to introduce Maia Jasper White, who is not only the co-founder and co-director of the Celestina Society. She is a very active musician in the Los Angeles music scene, in studios with many of the live performances that we get to see. And our students are very, very fortunate to have her as a teacher in chamber music. And when I saw her during one of her weekly Celestina events interviewing Indre, I thought, boy, this is a program that we should have for our Caltech audiences as well. I've often wondered, why does some music make me cry and some music make me cringe? And how does my brain know the difference between music and a crane or any number of other noises? And I thought, if I ask these questions, everybody must be asking these questions. And so Maia, we're throwing it over to you to get the answers in the next 30 minutes. Before I toss it to you completely, I just want to thank as well Ed Brown and Corrine Shore from our staff as our stage manager and our house manager. And Corrine will be working with all of you shortly so that you can ask your own questions after the presentation. Maia, it's all yours.
Sure. Thank you so much, Michael. I really appreciate your having me. And I'm just honored to introduce all of you to Indre Viskontas. This is someone who I could not admire more as a musician, as a person. Indre works at the intersection of neuroscience, cognitive science, psychology, music, and creativity. So what does that look like in her daily life? Well, she is an associate professor at the University of San Francisco. She is on faculty at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music. She is the creative director and co-founder of the Pasadena Opera. So that's something we'll talk about a little bit later on. You may have already seen or heard some of Indre's work in Pasadena. And she's a professional singer. Like Michael mentioned, she was the voice that you were hearing in the introductory slideshow, and has recently into operas as an opera director. So it is my honor to introduce you to Indre Viskontas. Turn your camera on. Hey.
Yeah. Hi, Maya. Thank you so much for your very generous introduction, and the admiration is totally mutual. And also thanks to Michael and the people at Caltech for inviting me. It's great to be here.
Awesome. Okay, so to get things started, because I think it's important for everybody who's here, I'm sure not everyone has read your book, so we can kind of get into the topics in a more general way. So how do you, from where you stand in your work, how do you define what music is?
Yeah, this is the first question that if you are going to look at music in the brain, you have to find an answer to. Because if you're going to study something objectively, you need to know what it is that you're studying, how you're defining it, and how you're differentiating it from something else, and doing that kind of comparison. And this becomes a really difficult problem the more you think about it. Most of us know music when we hear it. But we don't like to define it. It's a little bit like porn in that way. Like there's a certain, we know when it's like art and we know when it's not, but it's hard to tell exactly what you're gonna, if you're trying to program a computer to distinguish music from other sounds, it's actually really hard to do. So I like to actually look to some of the ways in which machine learning has solved this problem, which is forget defining it. Let's just create, an algorithm that is fed a whole bunch of information that is music and a whole bunch of information that's not music, and let it figure out what is music and what isn't. And I think that really actually is very close to how our brains do it. It starts from when we're babies, as we're trying to figure out what sounds are important. And so right from the early outset, as the brain is trying to parse the environment, it's going to adapt to the sounds that it hears. I like to say that, babies are really pretty useless, human babies, compared to like other animals. Like you couldn't like Bambi would not have survived if it was a baby, right? So why is that? There must be an adaptive reason for this. And I think the reason is that we have a very adaptable brain. It adapts to the environment. So how music becomes music is very much tied to your individual brain, and how that brain was, experienced sound, both in those first 3 years of life, which are really critical in terms of just generating the mappings. And then, I like to say there are a couple of sort of other sensitive periods in your life where music becomes really important. Now it becomes more about like your identity and what you're exposed to and taste, etc. So that's like a long-winded way of saying that music is really how your brain extracts meaning from sound. And that depends on a number of different things, including your own experience, but also what the brain is really good at, which is pattern recognition. So, I don't know, is that at all satisfying?
Yeah, completely. And I remember from your Cadence podcast, this is, I didn't even mention that, but Indre also was the co-host of Inquiring Minds, which is a podcast that has 13 million downloads, no big deal. And a podcast about music called Cadence. And I remember in one of the episodes, it was really striking. You played an example of somebody speaking a series of words on loop, and it started to sound like music because of what you just said about the patterns reoccurring. Do you have an example of something like that you can cue up?
Yeah, let me share it with you. So this is Diana Deutsch, who's a music cognition researcher. She's a pioneer. She's been doing music cognition research for 60 years, or probably way before it was cool. It's now cool. And so she was editing a piece of speech in her studio, and all of a sudden this happened. So I'll share it now.
The sounds as they appear to you are not only different from those that are really present, but they sometimes behave so strangely as to seem quite impossible. But they sometimes behave so strangely, 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 so strangely, so strangely, so strangely.
So, okay, so that was a sound wave that I played for you. It has one physical basis, you know, however it got to your ears in one thing. And what happened was that a part of it started to loop. And now it depends on what happens next, depends a little bit on you, how well you were able to pay attention. And if you're like most people, you got a little bored about halfway through. Your mind maybe started to wander. And that's usually a good thing in this case, in the case of this illusion, because if you get a little bored, your brain starts to listen to it differently. It no longer is parsing the word for word meaning of it, but rather other patterns like the melody, the rhythm, the musical aspects start to take form. And here's what's really remarkable about this illusion. So I'm going to play you the same sound wave, but without all the repetitions. So just the first sentence that she said. And, you know, if this works for you, you will hear her sort of jump into song halfway through where we get to the repeated section. So let's just try that.
The sounds as they appear to you are not only different from those that are really present, but they sometimes behave so strangely as to seem quite impossible.
So it's just fascinating because it is quite impossible that all of a sudden she goes from speaking to singing, right? And yet we all know, like, I can tell whether someone is singing versus whether they're speaking. But the other really remarkable thing, if you think about it for a minute, is that the actual physical stimulus hitting your inner ear and, you know, ultimately tickling your brain is the same the first time you listen to it and this time that you listen to it, but your experience of it is different. What you hear is different. And this illusion is so powerful that it lasts years, sometimes decades. So like something fundamentally changed in your brain that now anytime you hear this again, your brain automatically hears her as singing. Like, that's just weird.
Interesting. Now, it's funny, as you were talking about how hard music is to define, and well, let's just feed this to an algorithm and see what it comes up with. Something that I think especially the classical music world struggles with a lot is the question of genre. So how would you know, humans, we can tell the difference between R&B and classical and smooth jazz and this kind of thing. I'm curious about different cultures and different languages around the world and how that, you know, what you just played was in English. So like, do you think that there's a connection between the rhythms of speech in any given language and the kinds of music that cultures produce?
Definitely. And I think anytime musicologists or people that study music cognition are really interested in the universals, right? Because that's another way of defining music. Well, if every piece of music has X, then that must be a core feature of music. But the truth is it's really hard to find universals. And every time we think we have one, like, you know, an example is octaves. Like surely everybody hears octaves as being equivalent. And there was recently a study that came out where they found this group of people, which I believe was in South America, where they simply did not hear octaves as equivalent. They did a number of like tests on this, and they didn't make sense to them to think of octaves as equivalent. The one universal feature of music that does seem to be everywhere is repetition. Except in 20th century composed music or art music or whatever you want to call it, which explicitly avoided repetition. And it's considered highly revered in conservatories, but it's not super popular, right? So like, it's hard to find people to come to your new music concerts, as I know, as I was like most of my singing career, I sang, you know, contemporary classical music, whatever you want to call it. Sure. And it was really hard to drag people to my shows. And it wasn't
for the people who say, you know, that's not music, they're sort of right.
Yes, they're right, because their brain does not does not label it as music. So they don't experience it as music until they know what to listen for, what the patterns are that they have to hear. And the reason that repetition is so universal is because the repetition shows us where the patterns are, right? It gives us a beginning and an end, and then it loops again. And so now we know, oh, that's where the pattern is. So I can listen to what's happening within that little section and figure out, now the added extra layers of patterns. And, I think that's one of the things that we love about music, composers like Mozart, where there's layers upon layers of patterns and repetition and all kinds of different, we love that. We love finding new meanings like that. So, I think that when it comes to different genres, people can become experts, and they don't have to go to formal music training for this. They can become experts just by listening, but they become experts because what they can start to do is extract the meaningful patterns in that genre of music better than a novice. So a person who really knows R&B or hip hop or rap or jazz or whatever really well will literally hear it differently, will hear more in it than someone who's not exposed to that music and doesn't know what to listen for. Just like someone who's not exposed to Philip Glass or understand what to listen for will know what is going on.
Right, sure. Okay, so you just alluded to Mozart. That brings us to our next question for you, which is, there's this trope that, if you play Mozart for a baby, it'll make a baby smarter. So you've done a lot of work looking into, can music make us smarter? Does music make us smarter? Especially at an institution as elite as this one. I'm sure everyone's very curious about your answer.
Yeah. So, I wrote this book called How Music Can Make You Better. And of course, the first thing my mother got on the phone with, better at what? Right. And it's intentionally vague. It's intentionally vague. So if that was your question, yes, it's intentionally vague. There's a question mark in the title in a sense. But yes, most people, when they think about how to use music to make you better, think about it makes kids smarter, right? Mozart effect. And there's a whole cottage industry of this. I don't think I need to convince you or anyone else who's here that people think that. I mean, people think that especially Mozart's music, but some people it's Bach, for some people it's Beethoven, but, some composer that, lived 200 years ago wrote music that was genius. And now we should all, we can all benefit from it just by listening. And so, the origination of the Mozart effect actually was a paper that was written at UC Irvine in 1993. It was just a short little, I can show you a screenshot of it, but it's a short little paper. Sure. Here, I'll do this. It was called Music and Spatial Task Performance. So hold on, let me just do this. Here it is, Music and Spatial Task Performance. And basically what they saw, they had 3 groups of people do a whole bunch of IQ tests. And they had 3 conditions. In one condition, they played Mozart, I believe it was a piano sonata for 10 minutes. Or they played relaxation tapes. This was 1993, so no headspace, right? Relaxation tapes for 10 minutes, or people just sat in silence for 10 minutes. And it turns out, if you look at this graph, nice, effect of music compared with relaxation tapes and silence. And so this idea was, listening to Mozart, even for just 10 minutes before you do a whole bunch of IQ tests, boosts IQ, which is supposed to measure something stable about the individual, right? We should not be seeing effects like this. So, but the truth is that this effect lasted about 15 minutes, and there wasn't the proper control, right? So the proper control would not be relaxation tapes or silence. The proper control would be another piece of music, right? Or something that's a little bit more arousing. And so, if I was about to do a bunch of IQ tests, the last thing I'd want is something that makes me sleepy or tired. So, people have replicated this study in a sense, not replicated, failed to replicate it, basically by showing that if you play a pop song by a band called Blur, it's just as effective. If you read a chapter from a Stephen King novel, just as effective. I mean, frankly, if you have a shot of espresso or eat a chocolate bar, you're going to see these gains in comparison to these other groups, right? So this idea that passive listening to Mozart is going to make us smarter doesn't really hold up to a lot of scrutiny, although there have been lots of interesting other, there have been people who played, the same author, Francis Rocher, also played Mozart or Philip Glass to rats when they were in utero and then after they were born. And the ones that listened to Mozart have solved mazes more quickly than the ones who listened to Philip Glass. Showed no effect. Poor Philip Glass. Compared with white noise. Anyway, but so maybe there's something about priming that's an enriched environment, right? Like if the answer is Mozart or nothing, Mozart is going to win, because what we want when kids are growing up is a rich environment. We want them to have stimulation, right? And so that, and Mozart's music is potentially more stimulating in a number of ways than other kinds of music that are more simplistic, perhaps. But the real benefits, and this is something that really was drilled home to me a couple years ago when I started working on a white paper trying to put together all of the information about how music can affect kids as a way of like making the case that we should really keep music education in schools and that it shouldn't be cut the way it was, the way it is being cut. The thing that I realized, doing that research is that there is a dose response when it comes to active musical training. So the more active musical training you have, so by active, I mean you're participating in the music making, you're not just listening, the more we see benefits that go beyond just the fine motor skills or the auditory skills that we would expect to be enhanced by that kind of musical training. And the sweet spot seems to be at least 3 years. So at least 3 years of playing an instrument with weekly lessons and working on it seems to show what we call far transfer, which is where the skills that you're benefiting are not very similar to the skills that you're developing. So an example is with music, math or vocabulary. These are sort of more distantly related skills, and we do see some improvement. But here's the thing that really can, and we can track like longitudinally. We can do this by controlling for socioeconomic status. That was a big criticism of a lot of this early work. Like if you can afford to have music lessons, you're generally better off. And then there's been a lot of these programs that, in fact, the LA Phil has a great one, the Youth Orchestra of LA in the heart of LA, which is based on the Estema model of training young musicians in a way that really encourages them to participate. There's this longitudinal study that's being headed by Asal Habibi at USC showing measurable brain changes compared with active control groups, like the same kids from the same neighborhoods that are playing sports instead. But again, it takes years for those benefits to show themselves. And the argument that I make in the white paper really is an economic one, which is that what is most compelling to me, that when you have a program like this or any other program in a school, kids are more likely to show up to school. And if a kid shows up for band practice, they're going to stick around for math class as opposed to taking that day off. And school attendance is correlated or negatively correlated with doing things that might land you in jail later. And so if we can keep one kid out of jail because school for band practice instead of staying in their neighborhood, then we can pay for a teacher's salary for a decade, right? It's way more expensive to incarcerate someone than it is to teach an entire group of kids to play an instrument and get them in school. Anyway, so I'll get off my soapbox now, but that's I think the real Mozart effect is that it encourages kids to come together, to come to school, and then it's a very rich stimulus. So it lays the groundwork for a lot of things that we can do later on.
Right. It sounds like it's more the converse of playing Mozart for 10 minutes before an IQ test is 3 years of active participation, learning an instrument with weekly lessons, with social context, with greater likelihood of showing up for school and classwork. And it's a tougher sell in some way than this, oh, you mean I can listen to Mozart for 10 minutes? Just imagine what a genius I would be if I took a year of piano, So I see what you're saying. Okay, so we've established to some degree that there is this very nuanced and complex way in which music can, the study and active development of musical skills can make people better in the intellectual sense and to some degree in the social sense. What about in the physical sense? You know, can music heal us?
Yeah, so this is something that I think it's a really exciting time for anyone who's interested in the healing power of music, because, you know, for a long time, music therapists in particular have been working very hard to find interventions and figure out what works and what doesn't, to you know, use a very objective scientific outlook in terms of thinking about how we can use music therapeutically. And for a long time, they were very much ignored. But in the last 10 years, there's been a real, you know, surge in interest in this. And so I feel like it's just, we're living in a golden age. If this is something that's interesting to you, a lot of people are interested. You know, Francis Collins, the head of the NIH, is now, you know, all of a sudden there's grants for people to do research in this area, which was really hard to get 10 years ago. He partnered with Renee Fleming, who's, you know, obviously super famous opera singer, but also artistic advisor at the Kennedy Center. And they partnered with, you know, the NEA, and all of a sudden the National Endowment for the Arts, there's this kind of like, you know, push to really improve the quality of science, demonstrating or evaluating the effect of music to heal, and also just to make people aware of it. And I'm really fortunate to have just been given the role as the director of communications for the newly formed Sound Health Network, which is an initiative of the National Endowment of the Arts in partnership with UCSF and the NIH and Renee Fleming. And the idea, and the Kennedy Center. And the idea is like, you know, we really want to sort of promote the use of music in health and well-being, but make it scientifically rigorous. And what's exciting is that my job is really easy because now there's more and more evidence of how this works. And we can talk about many different applications. So from patients needing less sedation, if they're able to listen to the music that they choose before they go into surgery, to cancer patients when they get choral singing opportunities, their immune system is boosted, to people with Parkinson's disease who there's a Mark Morris dance company program called, I think it's Dance for PD, where they're using dance classes to get to learn to move again in the context of their illness. To what I think is a really dramatic one, and one that has really nice evidence of how this might work mechanistically, is the rewiring of the brain after brain injury. So just recently, PBS did a sort of look into Gabby Giffords, the congresswoman who was shot in the head. And so she was a very eloquent speaker, and so had a highly developed language production area in her brain. And the gunshot hit that area. And so one of the main symptoms that she has of a brain injury is that she finds it very difficult to produce speech. So she can understand everything you're saying, but you know, it's very hard for her to get the words out. Now, music therapists for a long time have known that sometimes one of the last things to go when you have a stroke is music, or if even in dementia. So, you know, there's also nice evidence that people with Alzheimer's disease who are no longer verbal or other forms of dementia can still react to music. They can still respond to music. You know, beautiful Alive Inside movie was sort of about that. So the question was, you know, how can you harness this ability to sing in a way that therapeutically can help the person not only get through their day if they can't speak, but also rewire the brain so that they can now speak better. And so this type of therapy that is very effective in these kinds of patients is called melodic intonation therapy. And the idea is very simple. Sometimes people can't say the words that they want to get out, but they can sing them. So what if you took words that we think people will want to say, like I love you or where is the bathroom, and you taught them a song in which they could sing it. So when they want to use that phrase, all they need to do is sing it, and then they can essentially get the, you know, the words across. And so there are a couple of components to it, but one is that you like have this constant beat, And then you just have a very simple melody. So like the, you know, the beginning would be like, I love you, or I love my children. Very simple. But somehow patients are able to do this much more easily than saying, I love you, or I love my children. So you go through these, you know, methodically, you go through all of these levels and all of this training, and then eventually you can actually start to use it in everyday context. So I just want to like play a tiny clip from this PBS special where you hear Gabby singing, and then you hear her also, you know, trying to speak, and you can kind of get a sense of how this therapy has worked for her.
Struggles.
Amazing grace.
One thing that helps Giffords, her love of singing and music. Last August, she gave a rousing speech titled Summoning Hope at the Democratic National Convention. Just 90 seconds long, Hirsch Cruz says it took months of preparation, and she sketched in musical and other notation on the script to help Giffords with the delivery.
We are at a crossroads.
One line in particular gave Giffords trouble.
I put one foot in front of the other, which was a really difficult line to master. And I just remembered hearing that in a song when I was younger. And so I found lyrics and music, and we just incorporated that into our sessions. And she used the music to help her get to the words.
I put one foot in front of the other.
So that's just an example of how this can work. But then, okay, so here's the remarkable thing that we can do now. We can map the connectivity in the brain and watch it change over time. And one thing that we've seen, so I'm going to share a couple more slides just to illustrate this, is that there is this one section of the brain. So quick brain primer of what's happening in this kind of speech production problem. So it's called aphasia, or Brocas aphasia. I'm sorry, we can ignore this misspelling here. So Brocas aphasia is essentially what Hodor has in the Game of Thrones, right? He can only say one word, Hodor, 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 right? But he can understand everything, and he can use that one word to illustrate different meanings, like if he's sad, Hodor, or if he's angry, Hodor, Hodor, right? Okay. So this is this region, Broca's area, that is responsible for speech production. And you'll notice it's really close to the primary motor cortex, which is the part of the brain involved in moving voluntarily. So if I want to raise my arm, that's, you know, the part of my primary motor cortex that represents the arm, you know, is engaged. Here you have your primary auditory area. So the first place, you know, essentially where your sound is processed, and next to it is called Wernicke's area, which is the speech comprehension area. So this is where you understand. So let's think about this for a minute. So some sound comes in, you process it, you understand it. Now you want to respond. So you need to send this information to Broca's area where the response can be prepared, who then sends the command to your motor cortex. And here's the wiring between these areas. It's just beautiful. And it's this great word, arcuate fasciculus, like one of my favorite words in the world. It's this beautiful track. And in most of us who are left language dominant, and that, by the way, is most people, including most left-handed people, this is a really thick piece of wiring on the left and pretty thin on the right. Now, in singers and instrumentalists, what we are trying to do is take what we hear and translate it into sound. And we use that's mainly a right hemisphere function. And so singers actually develop a thicker arcuate fasciculus on both sides of the brain, because that's what they do. So here's like mean volume of this area in non-musicians. And what you'll see is that the left is thicker than the right. So this is right dorsal, right ventral.
Okay.
Front and back. Okay. Now, don't get too bogged down here. All you want to look at is how much higher the singers and the musicians in general are. So on the right side, musicians have a thicker arcuate fasciculus than non-musicians, and singers thickest of all, including on the left. What happens in melodic intonation therapy is that you get a thickening of this pathway in the intact right hemisphere. So this is a neuroanatomical mechanism of how melodic intonation therapy rewires the right side of the brain to take advantage of this and essentially allow you now to express yourself using the right side of the brain instead of the damaged left one.
That's incredible. That's incredible. I'm heartened as an instrumentalist to know that we're not that far behind you singer types.
No difference on the right.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the effects that music can have on individual people, and to some degree, how that could play out with, for instance, children receiving active music participation in school, how that might improve society writ large. But can you speak a little more at length about what music can do for groups of people?
Yeah. So we know music is social glue. We know that it bonds us together. I mean, look at what happens when we don't get together and do concerts, right? We really crave it. And I think that's probably for a lot of people, in this, in this crowd, what's the one thing that you really are looking forward to when the pandemic restrictions are lifted? Going and experiencing live music together. I mean, I can't wait. But there's a number of reasons why this is the case, and we can understand this at a number of different levels. And so I can go into more detail as we go, but I'm just going to give you an overview, which is that there are a couple of hormones that we know are involved in attachment, oxytocin being one of them, prolactin being another, whose levels are higher when we're engaged in music that we like, especially if we get to synchronously move to it and there's someone else we can synchronously move to it with. So like, for example, here's just like a little baby bouncing. I don't know if you can see that. Yeah, right. So there's this wonderful study of bouncing babies. And when you bounce babies in sync to the music and they're bouncing in sync with the experimenter, the baby is more likely to be nice and to feel attached to that experimenter. So then if you like have another task where you're, basically asking the baby to share a favorite toy, they're more likely to share the toy if you've done this bounce baby in sync bouncing. Okay, we'll pause that. That's partly related to higher levels of oxytocin. If you snort oxytocin, your rhythm improves. You are actually a better dancer. You're better able to stay in sync.
And a performance enhancing drug.
Yeah, for some people, they might need it. Yeah. Forget the beta blockers.
Right, or caffeine. Yeah.
And if you look at brain rhythms, what we see is that musicians and non-musicians synchronize to the beat, even in terms of their overall brain oscillations. Musicians do it better than non-musicians. So that's something that happens with training. But all of this to say that there is this social aspect of synchronizing, moving together, that is very much tied to how we perceive beat and a big fundamental part of music. But even in like the social and communicative gestures, we see it. So here's like, babies that were given either active or passive music lessons, and then they were followed for 6 months. And the kids that were given the active music lessons here in the dark bars showed more those who were given just passive music lessons. So again, another reason we should, be active in terms of music making. So that's the positive end of how music can serve as social glue. But as everyone knows, music also, it can be very much tied to identity. And it can, and when levels of oxytocin are high, it's not just kumbaya, everything's great. The consequence of that is that you actually become aggressive towards people that you think are threatening your social group. So music can make you cringe, literally. It's not just that it leaves you neutral. It can make you feel fear or anger or resentment if you associate that music with a group of people that you find threatening, or that you think threaten, your well-being or the well-being of your kin or people you love. So that's how music can be polarizing, where we literally it can make us, feel hatred towards someone else if we associate that, with that group. So anyway, so that's a lot. We can talk a lot of other ways in which like music is involved in theory of mind and empathy and all of that. But
excellent. Excellent. I do have one final question for you. And before we open it up to the Q&A, this is for those of you watching and listening, this is your cue to think a little bit about what kinds of questions you might want to ask Indre while you have the chance. We have been collecting questions so far, and there are some really great ones. My last question for you, Indre, is, we've talked about all of these amazing powers that music has on the individual and group level. And the title of your book, How, I'm wondering, I guess if I were to echo your mother, my question would be, why? Why does music make us better? What is your kind of response to that?
Yeah, so my take on this is that music is a tool, like fire is a tool. So if we wanted to trace back what makes humans humans, a lot of people will point to a time in our evolutionary history when all of a sudden our skull size became exponentially larger. And, brain matter doesn't last in the fossil record, but skulls do. So we can assume that that's because we had bigger and bigger brains. And, there's a lot of sort of speculation as to what was the driving force that drove, bigger brains. And one thing that we started doing when our skull size increased is living in bigger social groups. So there's this whole social brain hypothesis that we evolved bigger brains because we're complicated and we need those big brains in order to understand each other and get along. But there's another idea or related idea, that the invention of fire allowed us to cook our food and get a lot of calories without a lot of effort. And this is why we don't live in a planet of the apes. So this is work done by this great Brazilian neuroscientist, Susana Herculano-Huzel, who basically counted all the brain cells we have, all the cells we have in our brains. And she found that human brains aren't actually that big compared to our primate bodies. They're actually kind of average, but gorilla brains are smaller than gorilla bodies will predict, because gorillas eat raw food all day. And they simply can't fuel. The brain is very metabolically costly. It's 2% of our mass, 20% of our metabolism goes to fuel our brain. And so the gorilla just can't manage to keep a brain like that functioning. We can, because we can cook our food, because we invented fire. And then so fire allowed us to sit around and do other things, including make music. Okay, so now you're like, what does that have to do with music? The music part is that I think that music evolved just around, that's just as old, evolutionarily speaking, as anything else we can imagine that makes us human. For a number of reasons, our babies understand our prosody, our music, the melody of our speech well before they understand the words. We use music to, learn the alphabet and teach each other and pass on cultural and phenomena. But the point is that we actually use music in many different ways. It is a tool. And so I think that from that perspective, the question of why music is more a question of what exactly are we using it for and how we're using it. It's a Swiss Army knife. And so different, and so this is the thing that really grates on me when people say, oh, music is so great because it's the one thing that activates the whole brain. And I'm like, yeah, if you're an amateur, but if you're a professional, it's very specific where it's happening in the brain. You know what I mean? Or certainly not when you're using it to ride your Peloton, hopefully that's not activating your whole brain. Hopefully you're thinking about, something more interesting than, whatever. But so over all of its uses, it might activate the whole brain, but certainly not in all its instantiations. So yeah, that would be my answer, is that it's a Swiss Army knife. And so we can use it for many different reasons. It's effective, but it's also not a panacea. So it's not like you can, sing your way out of a problem all the time. Or, speech is very good at that. If I need to tell, my husband what he needs to pick up at the grocery store, I can, sing Lua Descolorida until I'm blue in the face, and he's not going to come home with the milk. But speech is very good for that. But, if I want to bond with an audience or express my feelings in a way that words fall short, that's where you get to sing some Golubev.
Yeah. Well, Indre, thank you so much. This was amazing, and concludes the more formal part of our interview. So I believe at this point, Corinne, would you like to say hello and make everybody visible?
Yes. So hi, everyone. at this time, we are going to turn attendees into panelists so that we can see each other and have some community. And if you have questions for Maia or Indre, you can raise the hand button. It's the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, and then I will call on you. We've also gathered some of your wonderful questions in the Q&A, and Maia will start with those while we transfer you from attendees into panelists and get to see each other.
Great. So I would love to start with Gail Meltzer's question. Now, Corinne, if you wouldn't mind giving her the ability to unmute herself.
Yes. Let's see. Gail, I think I'm asking if you want to speak. Go right ahead.
Hi, actually, I'd rather that you read the question that I typed in the question.
Sure, sure. You got it.
Worded better.
Sure. So Gail asked, how do people's brains who were born totally deaf and were able to hear later in life through surgery or some other medical intervention, how do they experience music?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. You know, when I was debating about how to answer this question of what is music, the other story that I use is the story of a person with a cochlear implant, which is a little electrode that is implanted in the inner ear for a person who is deaf or hard of hearing. It's controversial when it's implanted in babies because for a number of reasons, including that there's an idea that it essentially diminishes deaf culture. So you're basically choosing to raise a child outside of deaf culture, but the reason that parents do it early on without waiting for the child to choose is that what we've learned is that the brain is very malleable in those early years. And at first, when the cochlear implant was invented, you know, the doctors were really kind of concerned about how the brain was going to learn to use this information in a way that is useful. And then they just decided to give it a go. And it turns out that the brain is actually very good at, with training and over time, figuring out what sounds are meaningful, even in this pretty impoverished stimulus. So, you know, the electrode, the implant maybe has like 22 leads, as opposed to the 1,000 hair cells, which are auditory receptors. But but the outcomes are the best if the babies are implanted early, so that they can go through this environmental adaptation stage with the implant in place. So as I mentioned before, you know, how your brain interprets the environment very much depends on what you expose it to. And so babies learn that, you know, this, when the sound is coming from their caregiver's mouth, it's something they should pay attention to, as opposed to when it's on the street and it's just a car. And so they learn to parse those kinds of sounds much better. A person who gets a cochlear implant later in life can still get a lot of the benefits, but it's harder. It's not as successful. And it takes a lot of very intensive training. So there are two reasons why patients with cochlear implants in general do not report liking music. They don't generally become aficionados if the cochlear implant comes in and they've been deaf for most of their life, right? So there's a difference if like they lost their hearing and now it's restored and their brain has, you know, has developed so that it knows how to process sound, and now it's just getting this impoverished stimulus. But if you're, and the reason is that ultimately in our day-to-day life, speech is more important than music. You know, I'm a musician, I love music, but the truth is that if you get your point across, it's much easier to say something than it is to play about it. So in these daily interactions, you know, that's where a lot of the effort goes, and it's very effortful. And so a lot of people just don't have the energy to then, you know, make that same effort to apply to music. And the other side of it is that the cochlear implants are designed to favor speech sounds. So they are already, you know, kind of sort of, yeah, like making it easier to understand speech sounds. So that's why. So it's impoverished stimulus and it's really hard to train the brain. And so it's a combination of a person not being able to put the time and effort into appreciating music, and also the electrodes not that precise.
Awesome. Okay, Jane Brucker, if you are still here, we'd love to have you ask your question. You should be getting the ability to unmute yourself now. If you'd prefer for me to ask it, I'm happy to do that as well.
Hi, yeah, I was so glad there was no camera. I climbed into bed with my cat. But the question I have is the part of the brain that lights up with religiosity. Is that the same part of the brain that lights up with music or tone?
So that's a good question. Yeah. So there, we're understanding more and more about religiosity and its underpinnings. One thing that I think is kind of cool is that there does seem to be a genetic component to how fervently religious you are, but not to which denomination you believe. So twins raised apart will be equally fervent, but might, believe in or, have different spiritual beliefs. But there is this right temporal lobe area where if people have seizures or a stroke, you can actually induce a religious experience, or people report sort of having a very spiritual experience. They see a vision, or they have a kind of they have a spiritual and religious experience. This is also a part of the brain that is very much involved in some of the emotional aspects of music making, and sort of greater sort of global pattern recognition of emotions, which are important to us in general. So there is a tie-in in terms of what part of the brain is involved in these two experiences. And anyone who has had a spiritual experience and has had a profound musical experience that they found very moving, there is a lot of similarity. There's a lot of overlap in terms of how that feels. You feel connected to something bigger than yourself. And so how we define, whether we define something as spiritual or whether we define it as musical, I think there are some people who would say I had a sublime musical experience, and some people will say I had a sublime spiritual experience. And so I think there is an overlap there. I do want to caution against this idea that a profound experience, whether it's musical or spiritual, is tied to one brain region. So the brain is not an island. It's highly interconnected. There are lots of, and this whole idea that, music is just a right brain function is not supported. Actually a lot of the stuff that we do, musically speaking, is in the left hemisphere. And a lot of the anatomical changes we see in musicians with training is actually more connections between the hemispheres, not simply more, volume or connection within the right hemisphere. So that's a short, sort of very long answer to your very short question, which is, yeah, I think there's some overlap, but I think there's overlap also in the experience that can help explain that too.
Great. I'm going to jump in real quick, and we're going to ask Christine Jones, and then we're going to go to some of our hands that are raised. Let's see, Christine. Christine, you should be able to unmute if you'd like to ask your question. I think you just have to accept it. Maya, do you have her question written out?
I do. She actually had just typed it in the chat too. She asked, species other than humans have musical ability. Examples are birds and whales. Have you looked at musical expression in other species and how it might relate to musical expression in humans?
Oh man, yeah. So as Maya mentioned, I host and write a podcast about what music can tell us about the mind, and I was very specific about that. It's not what neuroscience can tell us about music. It's what music tells us about what it means to be human. Because to me, that's the more interesting way of looking at it. And I just did in season 3 that just came out, I think, in January, an episode on music in animals. And it interviewed a number of people, including musicians like David Rothenberg, who make music with birds, literally a conversation with birds, or David Soldier, who taught elephants, the Thai Elephant Orchestra, to use music, and it's part of conservation efforts, as trying to show people that we should protect these animals. If we see them drumming, all of a sudden we feel more connected to them and more likely to want to protect them. But to me, the most interesting part of that story, and David Tai too, who writes music for cats, where he essentially writes music in the frequency space that the animals actually can hear. So it sounds good to the cats, but maybe not to us. There's so many things we can learn from these relationships, and so many things that we can learn about ourselves, but also about other species. But the one sort of punchline that I found most compelling was when I talked to Sue Savage Rumbaugh, who is a primatologist who was, she essentially over the course of decades spent time with bonobos and taught them how to speak using human language and also listen to what they had to say. And Peter Gabriel, the musician, was interested in this. And so she had him come to the lab and play music for the bonobos. And at first the bonobos were not really interested in, like, they provided them with little synthesizers and, musical instruments, but they weren't really interested in playing with Peter. They were interested in listening to Peter play. And I think a lot of us would probably feel the same way. If there's like, Yo-Yo Ma came to my house, I wouldn't really want to jam with him. I'd just be like, hey, why don't you play me something, right? But then Sue had this insight where she had two bonobos who were the children of another bonobo. And she said to the two bonobos, let's play a song for your mom who's in the other room. And all of a sudden they wanted to play. And so that to me was really interesting, that we play music for other people. When we think that what we need to say in music is going to be heard by someone else, that's when we feel like we actually want to do it.
Wonderful. It looks like we have a question from Stephen Homestead. Stephen, I've just given you speaking power.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Indre. This was really amazing. I didn't expect to be emotionally moved by your presentation, but I am a composer, and I was thinking about your discussion where the two kind of like sides of the brain are firing, from performative singing and like learning an instrument. Have you had research into the like writing of music?
So really interesting. So, and I would say, all the work that I've talked about today is like not my original research. I just read other people's research and then tell the general public about it. So, but when it comes to composers, so when I have done my own research, it's actually been largely working with composers because I feel that composers really understand what effect music should have on other people because they're writing it into the music. So there are a number of ways in which this can be of interest. There's so many different directions that we could go. But I guess the one thing that I will, and I think it also, one thing that we also realize is that composers are very individual. So like, for example, there's this one study that makes me laugh every time where they were assessing children's musical creativity using this task where the children had to like make a piece of music, and then they had to judge the creativity of that piece of music, by a number of different groups. So they had their music teachers judge the creativity, they had their peers, like other 6-year-olds, judge the musical creativity, and then they had the composers judge the musical creativity. And like the reliability of the judgments, so that means like how much do people agree that, child composition A is good and composition B is not, was really high when it came to the peers and the teachers, and like 0 when it came to the composers. Like the 3 composers had totally different ratings of what was creative out of these children's creativity. And that speaks to the fact that composers really have very different ways in which they compose. Some composers, they have very different strategies. And so there's just this real, richness in terms of what's happening in the brain. Every composer that brings a different strategy is going to have a different way that their brain is activated. But here's like the one thing that I think you could take away that's, maybe a little bit more interesting, is that if we tell a person that a piece of music was composed by a human being, we see very different brain activation than if we tell the person that the piece was composed by a computer. And it doesn't matter if the piece was actually composed by a human or a computer, you know, we can do those, we can manipulate that. You know, there's lots of 20th century composed music that sounds like it was composed by a computer that we can tell people was, you know, and what we find is that no matter what, when the person thinks that the music that they're listening to was composed by a human, they engage their empathy network. They engage theory of mind. They listen for intention in the music, which they don't do if they think it was composed by a computer. And then there's this one, well, just one more quick thing. There's this AI, artificial intelligence, called EMI, Experiments in Musical Improvisation, or EMI. And I think it's David Cope who created this, and basically fed all of Bach into the program and then had it compose Bach, you know, by rearranging the parts, right? And so whether this is actually Bach or not, we can argue about that. But when this was played in a performance, and David Cope played some of his own music, people were much more likely to say that his music was composed by a computer and that the EMI composed Bach music was actually Bach. But interestingly, people got really upset when they found out that they had been duped. So when you listen to a piece of music and you have an emotional reaction, and then someone tells you it was a computer, it makes you angry, which is kind of interesting.
It is interesting. We're going to go to Sarah. I'm going to ask if you can unmute. Sarah? Hold on, you're still muted. There you go.
Yeah. Oops, yeah. I tried to unmute myself and then, yeah. Okay. Yeah, so I actually was, you know, I feel like I probably have a bunch of, you know, science-related questions if I were to, you know, think, but, you know, this whole time I've just been really curious to hear a little bit about your career trajectory. And, you know, pursuing both, you know, science and music to such a high level, because, you know, in a PhD program and, you know, really like music and, you know, do want to, you know, keep it, you know, in my life and, you know, capacity and, you know, to, you know, whatever extent I can. And so, yeah, if you could just talk a little bit about that, that would be amazing.
Yeah. So is your thesis advisor on this call? I don't think so. Yeah, so my advice to you is, like, don't tell them, but continue to practice as much as you need to. For one thing, I think it will make you better at your PhD work. I mean, that worked for me. Like, the days in which I did not sing, or where I started to feel like I needed to just put my head down and, like, just work on the science, were the days that I did the worst science. I mean, I just was not good at my job. I was not creative. I wasn't thinking, you know, I would even make, you know, mistakes. Because for me, if a period of time goes by where I'm not performing, I get very irritable. There's like a drive to do that. On the other hand, I think that, like, so for me, people always used to say, you're going to have to choose, you're going to have to choose, you're going to have to choose. And then I would just say, okay, well, when the time comes, I'll choose. And then it just never came. Like, I just kind of always had a project in the long-term plan, would either be science or music, and vice versa. And as long as I always had a project to work on, I always found the time to get everything else done. And now we live in this golden age where people are really starting to see, not only is there a big interaction between music and science, but there's value in using music to make the science better and using science to make the music better. You know, it goes both ways. And I think that there are going to be a lot more opportunities, you know, to do this kind of cross-disciplinary work. So, you know, my advice would just be, like, just if it brings you passion, keep doing it. And eventually you'll get good enough that someone's going to figure out a way to pay you for it. I mean, you know, I spent years as a fit model trying on clothes for the Gap after I'd gotten my PhD so that I could pay for music lessons. You know, I did all kinds of things. I'd know, you know, I'd know, you know, I worries about that, but at the same time, I kept doing it at a level so that now, like, you know, people call me to, you know, do talks like this at Caltech.
Thank you.
Hey, Sarah, I'm glad that you hopped on for this. So this was actually our last question. So Indre, thank you so much for spending, you know, the hour plus with us. And there have been some questions about how to access the recording. I believe that will be dropped in the chat if it hasn't already, or if somebody could, that would be great. But thank you to all of you for joining, and we appreciate seeing you and hope to see you at another online event soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, Indre. Good to see you.
Bye, you too.
And I want to thank everyone as well for joining us for our second Behind the Book presentation, our author series here at Caltech. Indre, you raised so many points. I hope you write another book so we'll have another reason to bring you here so we can do this once more, because I think for every question that was asked, there probably are 3 or 4 or 5 that didn't get asked and that are covering a whole range of topics from discipline, dealing with Alzheimer's, dealing with stroke, dealing with any one of a number of the topics are probably worth a conversation in and of themselves. I want to thank the people over at Academic Media Technology, Leslie Maxfield and Becca Rose for supporting this event. Again, I would like to thank Corrine Shore, Ed Brown, our house manager and stage manager. And I want to thank all of the staff at Public Programming and at the Office of Strategic Communications. Maya, you introduced me to Indre months ago. And by the way, folks, I'm Michael Alexander. I forget to introduce my name. I am the Director of Public Programming at Caltech, and don't mind getting ideas from any of you and reactions to programs like this so that we can do the best job possible of programming for your interests. Next week is Earth Week. Remind you to just go to events.caltech.edu and get a sense of all of the different events that are going to be taking place because of Earth Week. And I will thank again the Caltech Employees Federal Credit Union and the Friends of Beckman Auditorium, and all of you can join that to help support programs like this. And I'm just going to leave you with one comment. I once heard that my brain was my most important organ, and then I realized what part of my body was telling me that. Well, I still think my brain is my most important organ, and Indre, you've sort of reinforced that tonight. Thank you all for joining us. Let's all thank, as the deaf would, with our waved hands, and thank both Indre and Maya for such a fascinating evening. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.